What's up, everybody? Today we're diving into Carl's Doomsday Scenario, the second installment in the Dungeon Crawler Carl series by Matt Dinniman. And let me tell you, this one was quite the ride. Overall, the second book is solid, and it continues where the first one left off. I had some minor issues with Doomsday that I didn't have with the first, but they were relatively minor quibbles that didn't stop me from enjoying it. Just some small things with pacing and how the story unfolds. But yeah, it's a good book. I'm starting to understand why people really like the series. I mean, I'm loving it too. The first book starts everything off so that I wasn't sure if Dinniman could maintain the same fast paced and fun storytelling, but he mostly nails it. Now, if you're new to the channel, welcome to Mysterious Galaxies. This is where I talk all things science fiction, fantasy, and horror. So if you're into exploring some weird, imaginative, and some downright insane books, like this one, you're in the right place. Now, before we get into the nitty-gritty of Carl's Doomsday Scenario, let's do a quick recap of what this series is all about for anyone who hasn't read the first book. So Dungeon Crawler Carl. Now, where do I even begin? The series falls into the lit RPG genre, which, if you're unfamiliar, is basically where stories feel like video games. You've got characters leveling up, collecting loot, and upgrading skills, and battling through all kinds of challenges like they're in some giant RPG dungeon. And that is exactly as wild as it sounds. Now, it's a series that doesn't fit into any one particular genre. The main narrative is definitely science fiction, but the dungeons, they take place in a fantasy setting, at least so far in the first two books. It's humorous, it has some horror elements, and a bunch of other things you'd find in different genres. But I think this is why people love it so much. It doesn't subscribe to one thing, and so it can truly go anywhere. It's really fresh and unique. And just kind of like as a refresher, we have this guy Carl, who is an ordinary man thrust into a video game-like dungeon after Earth is destroyed by aliens. They come and they just steamroll us. Players navigate the dungeon facing various challenges and enemies, while trillions of alien viewers from across the known and unknown galaxies monitor their progress on a TV show called Dungeon Crawler World. As an aside, I think one of the cooler aspects that goes without much discussion is that these aliens have always been here. They're just waiting for this year's dungeon crawl. And it's just a really creepy idea that they were just sitting and waiting to come along and crush our world, wipe out 99% of humanity, and thrust the remaining 1% into a life or death scenario. This dungeon is huge. At one point, I think the system AI says the dungeon is underneath the Earth's crust, and each level spans from one side of the planet to the other. And there are 18 levels, although the furthest anyone has ever progressed in previous dungeon crawls was, I think, the 13th floor. And beyond the 9th floor, various aliens who have sponsored the event and individual crawlers, they begin bargaining with players. If you stop playing at this level, we'll make you an immortal NPC or something to that effect. It's how Mordecai, a secondary character who becomes our group's manager, ends up stuck in the game year after year. It's pretty scary to think about. In the first book, we left off with Carl and Donut descending into the second level of the dungeon. They've picked their classes, they met up with Meadowlark crew, they faced off against Maggie Mai and Frank Q, and then they squared off against some fire-breathing meth-dealing llamas, because, that's just totally something normal and rational. But they also built this badass hobgoblin motorcycle in order to get around. While the plot can be boiled down from, Carl going from point A to B and then repeating the same thing over and over, I never had a problem with it because you meet so many interesting characters along the way. But when we get to Carl's Doomsday Scenario, the second book, things shift. Carl's not the clueless guy he was in the first book. He knows what's going on now. And so the story has to move in a different direction. Instead of continuing with the classic dungeon crawling format where Carl and Donut are constantly moving through different narrow tunnels, this book takes a different approach. The dungeon crawling aspect takes a back seat, and we're introduced to a more of an open world style setup. So imagine a giant medieval themed setting with its own set of rules and quests to complete rather than a tight level based structure of the first book. It almost feels like a major shift from a dungeon crawler to something more like an open world RPG. So instead of progressing through a series of smaller contained cave-like systems, Carl and Donut spend most of their time on a single massive level tackling various quests and objectives. There's a lot more focus on exploration, interacting with the world around them, and completing major quests that have huge rewards. And I had some mixed feelings about it. On one hand, the book still retains the chaotic fun and humor that made the first one such a blast. But then on the other hand, I really miss that sense of progressing deeper and deeper into the labyrinth, not knowing what's going to come around the next corner. This open world approach feels a little more predictable. You can see the challenges coming from a distance, which takes away some of the tension and excitement that came with the tight claustrophobic feel of the dungeon in the first book. It's not a bad direction, but it definitely changes the pacing and overall feel of the story. And with that said, the quests themselves are pretty interesting. Carl now has the ability to accept different quests, sort of like missions in a video game, and these come with their own sets of rewards. The more quests he completes, the more experience points he earns, which allows him to upgrade his skills and get some really cool magical items. But as much fun as that is, I couldn't help but feel like it made the story feel more like a traditional fantasy adventure and less like the unique dungeon crawling chaos I loved in the first book. So while Carl's journey and Carl's Doomsday Scenario is still packed with action, humor, and the same quirky charm, it definitely takes the story in a new direction. Now, whether that's a good thing or a bad thing will depend on how much you enjoyed the structure of the first book versus the more open-ended quest format here. Now, let's break down what worked and what didn't. First off, on the positive side, this book is still a ton of fun. Matt Dinniman continues to nail the balance between absurdity and action that made the first book so engaging. The humor is as sharp as ever, sometimes juvenile, sometimes witty, but always entertaining. Carl and his talking cat Princess Donut are back, and their dynamic is still one of the best parts in the series. Their banter is hilarious, and their relationship has developed even more since the first book. Donut isn't just comic relief, she's an integral part of the story, and her sassiness combined with Carl's no-nonsense attitude, it creates some really memorable moments. It's kind of a duo that you can't help but root for, even when things get completely ridiculous. And Dinniman, he doesn't hold back when it comes to throwing Carl into the most insane over-the-top situations. Whether it's battling bizarre monsters or navigating strange chaotic environments, the action sequences are still as zany and high energy as you'd expect. If you love the first book's blend of wild scenarios and laugh-out-loud moments, there's still plenty of that here. The stakes are higher, the challenges are tougher, and the rewards are even more ridiculous. And honestly, it's still a blast to see Carl and Donut navigate through it all. I've already mentioned it, but the change in structure didn't entirely work for me. In the first book, a lot of the tension came from the dungeon crawling format and Carl learning how to play. It kept you on your toes. But now that Carl is more adept and the second level is open world, the tension is kind of lost. You see things coming, and the story is a bit more predictable as a result. The open world format gives Carl and Donut more space to move around, but it also removes some of the mystery and excitement. Now, the pacing is another area where I had some issues. Don't get me wrong, there's still plenty of action, but the story feels slower at times, especially when it comes to two major quests Carl has to complete. One of the quests is great. It's really engaging and fun and packed with this kind of chaotic energy we expect from the series. but the other, not so much. It dragged on a little bit too much for my liking. So the quest structure is going to be hit or miss for some folks. You know what? Now that I'm talking it through out loud, I'm starting to change my mind on how I viewed it. The pacing definitely slows down a bit, but the quest structure, on second thought, it kind of adds depth to the narrative. Maybe because it's also like I'm in the process of replaying Baldur's Gate 3, but there's something about completing quests and earning rewards that is very satisfying, even in, book format. So I love that it gave more focus to Carl's development as a character. Instead of rushing from one fight to the next, the quests allowed for more character interactions and world building. We got to see Carl strategize and plan and work through these challenges in a way that felt more methodical than the frantic pace of the first book. And while I do miss some of that nonstop action, this new structure, it brought a fresh perspective to the story, which allowed me to appreciate the creativity of Dinniman's world even more. So, why should you read Carl's Doomsday Scenario? Despite my initial gripes, this book is a lot of fun. If you're a fan of RPGs, lit RPGs, or Dungeons and Dragon style adventures, this series will keep hitting all the right notes for you. The quests, the leveling up, the skill gains, the magical loot. It's like playing an RPG in book form. And while the plot takes a bit of a different turn here, the sheer creativity and absurdity of the situation Carl faces will keep you hooked. And I can't stress this enough. The audiobook, it's an absolute must. Jeff Hayes, the narrator, he's a god tier performer. I'm not even kidding when I say the narration takes the series to another level. The voices, the accents, the way he brings Carl and Donut to life, it's fantastic. He's up there with the best narrators I've ever heard. If you've never listened to an audiobook before, Carl's Doomsday Scenario is a perfect place to start. Well, maybe the first book is, but trust me, and it's an experience. Plus, the characters are still as strong as ever. Carl continues to be great. Everyman hero, and Princess Donut is, she's snarky, adorable, and hilariously overpowered. The additions of the new characters, they also spice things up, and even though some of the side characters still feel flat, I had a lot of fun with the overall cast. So to wrap things up, Carl's Doomsday Scenario is another solid entry in the Dungeon Crawler series. It's fun, it's zany, it's a wild ride. Sure, I had a few issues with the pacing and the plot direction, but at the end of the day, I still had a blast reading it. I'm definitely looking forward to the next book and seeing where Carl and Donut's adventure goes from here. If you haven't started this series yet, not sure why you're watching this, but I appreciate it nonetheless. Now is the perfect time. Book 7 is scheduled to release later this month. So grab the other books, especially if you're a fan of audiobooks. Again, Jeff Hayes will blow your mind. But, that's it for today. So thanks for watching. And as always, happy reading.